ADBI has been conducting extensive multi-country surveys to gauge the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic and related government policies on households, small enterprises, and key sectors such as farming and tourism in developing Asia and the Pacific. In this podcast, ADBI Dean Tetsushi Sonobe discusses what the surveys are revealing about the state of the region's pandemic response and policy keys for promoting an inclusive and sustainable recovery moving forward. Dean Sonobe, thank you for joining Asia's Developing Future. Can you start by explaining the underlying challenges that policymakers have faced during the COVID-19 pandemic and how ADBI's COVID-19 impact surveys could help to guide future policy decision-making?
Policymakers have to respond to an economic problem before the problem's whole picture and root cause are found and confirmed. They have to act on their hunch and common sense. Economic research teams like us try to assist policymakers to revise their initial policy responses by investigating what's really happening and how terrible it is and why. But when we start investigation, our knowledge is so limited that we have to start from those sectors at which the initial policy response are targeted. And we act on our hunch and common sense as well. But our hunch and common sense are not at all different from yours because economics is just about what people are doing. For our surveys, we chose MSMEs, micro and small medium enterprises, because MSME sector is the largest or second largest employer in the most economies in Asia and the Pacific. And because economic package programs of many governments and ADB are pouring much money into this sector. Why are we conducting household survey? Well, like you care on the situations of children and elderly people. We want to know their situations and to cover their situation, and the best approach would be to conduct a household survey. Why are we conducting farmer survey? Well, initially we tended to think that the COVID-19 pandemic is more urban than rural. But then migrant daily wage workers in urban areas lost their jobs and began going back to their home villages. Then a series of natural questions arise as to what will happen, the kind of health condition in rural areas. The coronavirus is spreading in rural areas where the capacity of hospitals and health clinics is much more, even more limited. Some households in rural areas are dependent on remittance from their family members working in urban areas. So those questions must be addressed by the survey of farmers. As you know, the tourism is one of the hardest hit sectors, and the Asia and Pacific region has several small island states heavily relying on tourism. So the tourism sector was chosen.
What are some of the survey's key findings, starting with those for micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises?
In a country like the Philippines, where the health situation is worse and the lockdown was more strict, 2/3 of firms surveyed immediately suspended business activity, and those still operating cut operations by half. Wholesale and retail trade was the sector most adversely affected by the what they call enhanced community quarantine. Work from home was not a feasible option for any workers in most enterprises, especially micro enterprises. And supply chain bottlenecks were mainly caused by slow custom clearance on imported goods, limited operations with local suppliers, and the shortage of truck and drivers. By contrast, in a country like Vietnam, which has had a much shorter period of lockdown, vast majority of firms we surveyed continue operation, even though they reduced employment and wage payment. In the latter type of countries, like Vietnam, the majority of firms expect their sales revenue this year as a whole will not be smaller, so much less than those in the previous years. So damage could be very small for them. But in all countries, regardless of severity of lockdowns and other conditions, those MSMEs that had adopted e-commerce before the outbreak of the pandemic are doing much better than those others.
ADBI also examined COVID-19's impact on households and related policies in Southeast Asia. What do the survey results show in these areas?
From our household survey, we found a lot of things. Among them are that more than 70% of all households reported declines in income. About one-third of households overall reported declines in household expenditure. And the income declines was greatest for the self-employed, and followed by farmers and fishermen, and then wage earners and household business and self-employed type people show the largest share of declines across all countries except Indonesia, where the farmers and fishermen had severest impact. And then more than 40% of households reported at least one of their members lost jobs or had work hours reduced. The biggest sources of funding to offset income declines were drawdown of cash and savings, which accounted for about half of the respondents, and the deferred payment and the debt repayment and applications for government aid. So government aid, those households dependent on the government aid account for about one-third. And the impact on education were very large in Myanmar and the Philippines, with roughly half of households with children in school reporting that their children stopped attending schools due to COVID-19. By contrast, Thailand, this share was only 13%. So the variation among countries is very large. And then 62% of households with kids still in school reported that schools offer online learning. But this share varied dramatically from country to country. For example, in Laos, PDR only 10%, and Myanmar only 6%. So this shows severe international digital divide.
What about the impacts of the pandemic in rural communities and among farmers? What does ADBI's survey findings reveal?
From the Bangladesh survey, we learned that about 40% of farmers are growing rice, other crops, and vegetables, and the difficulty in production and selling due to labor shortage and the unavailability of traders due to COVID-19. About 20% of rural households received remittance from their household members working in urban areas within the country, and about 10% of those households are receiving remittance from abroad, mostly the Middle East. And each category, the average amount of remittance became half after the outbreak of COVID-19.
Based on the data collected from the various surveys, what policies do you think could help mitigate the impacts of COVID-19 on micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises and households in developing Asia and the Pacific?
For MSMEs, a payroll subsidy for workers was the policy measure most needed for firms to survive during the pandemic, followed by deferred tax payment and concessional loans. And the provision of skill training programs for business owners and their employees, and that allows them to digitalize their business operation. That would be very useful. For households, unconditional or conditional cash transfers and other kinds of social protection measures will be very, very useful. And for households with children going to school, certain policy assistance is needed to address the problems of no access or poor access to internet connection, and also lack of tablets and PCs.
To wrap things up, what are the areas where further research is needed to help optimize the region's pandemic response and recovery prospects?
Currently, many governments and central banks offer large-scale economic packages and extreme money easing measures. But nobody knows what will happen in future, when or if the US or other large developed economies have improved earlier than developing economies and interest rates in the world begin rising. Your lenders may suddenly come to you and begin demanding repayment. Your business may go bankrupt. So we need to continue to watch the financial situation of small businesses carefully. At the same time, we will deepen our understanding, especially about those issues related to digital divide. So we need to study deeper exactly where the problem of digital divide is particularly serious and who should be targeted or who should be the target of policy intervention eliminating digital divide so that policy measures can have stronger impact. And both at ADB and ADBI are conducting these surveys of household, MSMEs, and farmers or tourism industry as repeat surveys, tracing the same respondents over time. By doing so, we will be able to cover the evolutionary process of economic recovery. A better understanding of this process will provide valuable lessons for future policy making at the time of the next crisis, which we don't like to have, but we do have to prepare for.
This has been Asia's Developing Future, brought to you by the Asian Development Bank Institute in Tokyo. See the show notes for the transcript and related material. For more information about us, please visit adbi.org.